I'm hoping to sort of spend about half an hour talking about some innovations that will sort of coming out of some of the research that we're doing and that are relevant for health and performance. A little bit of background about myself. As Rob said, I'm a professor in sport and exercise sciences at the University of Kent. I've been at the University of Kent now for just short of 9 years. Prior to that, I've worked as a respiratory physiologist and an applied physiologist, working directly with elite athletes. So I've been employed by the British Olympic Association and the English Institute of Sport, directly supporting elite athletes, taking care of their respiratory function. And at the University of Kent, Rob mentioned that I head up the exercise respiratory clinic. And at that respiratory clinic, we offer a service where we deal with individuals who are experiencing exercise respiratory issues. Sometimes that's related to asthma, sometimes it's related to other issues. And that really starts to sort of crux around this innovating for the future and where this innovation might come from in terms of helping individuals manage their respiratory symptoms. And the reason why we're interested specifically in respiratory symptoms, and I see a lot of it from a sporting point of view, is because exercise respiratory symptoms are the most commonly reported symptoms by athletes. And chronic conditions like asthma are the most chronic conditions experienced by athletes. But that said, so a lot of my experiences are from athletes, but a lot of these experiences are mirrored within the sort of general population and issues around diagnosis of respiratory issues in the general population as well. So I'm going to sort of talk through. I'm probably going to bring it from my experiences working with athletes, but there are comparisons to be made with the general population. So I think the innovations that I'm going to sort of propose and maybe what we need to look for aren't just relevant for athletes; they're going to be relevant for the general population as well in terms of managing respiratory issues. But we're going to start. If it's going to allow me to click on. Come on, computer. There we go. It's going to start. We're going to start by. I'm just going to show you a video of an athlete. Now, this athlete is a kind of a typical athlete that I see on a regular basis. And this athlete came to us because she was basically complaining that she couldn't complete any of her high intensity sessions. So a high intensity for this athlete might involve a series of 200 or 400 meter sprints with a short recovery, say a couple of minutes, and then doing that again. And what she was finding was that she was complaining of a tight chest. She was complaining of wheezing. She was complaining that she couldn't get a satisfying breath in. She'd already been to her doctor, and the doctor had given her a diagnosis of asthma. She'd been using asthma inhalers. The asthma inhalers weren't working. When I say weren't working, stopping any of the symptoms that she was experiencing when she was running. So I'm just going to show you the video now, and then I'll sort of show a before and after of her at the end of the presentation. So just listen out for her wheeze. Look at the way she's breathing. Brilliant. You stand up for me. You stand up. Just look straight. Stand still and look straight ahead. Stay there. Keep looking straight ahead. Okay, so you can hear that she's got a wheeze when she breathes in. If you watch her breathing pattern, you'll see her stomach and her chest that move at the same time. If you look at her posture, sort of neck sticking out in front of her body, and she's complaining that it's really difficult to get her breath in. And so it's very difficult to understand what's going on with that athlete. And this is kind of the problem. This is where we need innovations for the future. Is we need better tools, better understanding of respiratory issues to help us unpick how much of that problem might be an asthmatic issue, how much of that problem might be something else. And so we're going to I'm going to talk through some of the issues around the diagnosis of athletes, such as this athlete here, and then talk about some of the solutions we're starting to come up with from within the research we're doing at Kent, and then maybe sort of talk through a little bit more of a bit of a wish list of maybe what that solution might turn into. So the problems of respiratory symptoms, and this is isn't just related to athletes. Respiratory symptoms themselves. So you might think of sort of respiratory symptoms related to exercise, might be wheezing, coughing, tight chest, difficulty breathing. Now, when we look at it's athletes, and it's the same thing with non-athletes, those symptoms alone are non-specific. So those symptoms alone don't tell us, it's very difficult to diagnose anything from those symptoms alone. Which make it difficult because the causes of those symptoms could be from a variety of different issues. And this is just a few that I've thought of, but there are many more. And I've tried to be very broad with these definitions. But if you could probably break each one of these down into various into multiple specific issues. But they could be getting respiratory symptoms because of a physical limitation, i.e., fitness, or maybe carrying a little bit too much weight. It could be from respiratory disease like asthma. You could be experiencing these respiratory symptoms because you've got a laryngeal disorder, so it's more of an upper airway issue that's maybe causing that sort of tightness, difficulty getting air in. It could be an anxiety or hyperventilation issue that's causing an individual to feel tight-chested and a bit over anxious to breathe. Or it could be another cardiopulmonary issue. So it could be more of a cardiovascular issue as well. And the reason why I've bolded the respiratory disease, laryngeal disorders, and the anxiety hyperventilation syndrome is because those are the ones that are probably harder to diagnose. So there's more the tests that we got for sort of cardiopulmonary diseases, like cardiovascular disease and things. They're pretty well understood, and they're pretty good at identifying the problems. But with respiratory disease like asthma, laryngeal disorders, anxiety hyperventilation syndrome, and breathing pattern disorder, those kind of things, there's not a perfect test for them, and there is an art in the diagnosis, which is great if you're working with someone who's really nice and experienced. But if you're working with someone who maybe isn't as experienced or isn't as good at interpreting the assessments, maybe the diagnosis starts to get compromised a little bit. And as I said, athletes are more likely to experience asthma than the general population. So within athletes, managing respiratory issues is a really big issue. And you can see, so the prevalence here, so EIB is exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. It's basically a form of asthma that's basically it's asthma that is specific to doing high-intensity exercise, essentially. But when my research group has gone and actually looked at the asthmatic population within sports, we see that asthma is prevalent. So the UK population prevalence of asthma is around about 9%, 9 to 15%, depending on which way you look at the prevalence. And you can see in a lot of these sports, the asthma prevalence, or the EIB prevalence within the sports, is significantly higher than the general population. So we look at sports like cycling, field hockey, rowing, swimming, football. They all have a significantly higher prevalence of asthma than the general population. And we tend to see the higher prevalence in the sports that have a high ventilatory demand and or take place in a polluting environment as well. And so those sports that are kind of more asthmagenic in nature, they're the sports we tend to spend a lot of time focusing our respiratory care to. But it's important to note that asthma isn't the only issue why an athlete might experience respiratory symptoms. And so if we go to just look at the general population as well, as I said, the prevalence in the general population is not 9 to 15%. But there is a high misdiagnosis rate within the general population of 33% of the asthma diagnosis is incorrect, which is massive. So you think about, you go along to the doc, maybe complaining of tight chest or whatever, and they might do assessments, they might not do assessments, they might simply just give you an inhaler based on your symptoms, and then you've got a diagnosis of asthma. And we know that there's not a perfect test, which I'll go on to explain it in a minute, but it's a high misdiagnosis rate, and that's not just in the general population, that's the case in elite athletes as well, which I'll show you again in a minute. And it's not just a problem in terms of maybe a patient maybe using an inhaler they shouldn't use, but actually misdiagnosis of asthma costs a lot of money. there's not actually any direct analysis within the UK, but one that's been done in Canada very recently suggests the average direct healthcare cost per patient with misdiagnosed asthma is about £180 million over a 12-month period. So it can add up significantly over time. So we need to make sure that, one, from a patient management and a patient experience point of view, the assessment is appropriate and it's accurate to diagnose the condition that the athlete is actually, or the individual is experiencing. But also from a cost saving point of view, if we get that diagnosis right and we get the management and the care right for that individual, that regardless of what the respiratory issue is, we're going to save the healthcare system money and also free up time of practitioners to actually care for people, for more people. So it's important from that point of view. So if we look at kind of asthma itself and what just looking at asthma alone, why is asthma diagnosis not perfect? And the reason for that is sort of multifaceted. Asthma itself is triggers for asthma. There's not the same trigger for every individual. There's lots of different phenotypes. So lots of different types of asthma. So it makes it difficult to diagnose. Asthma diagnosis should always, at the moment, the directive for asthma diagnosis is there should always be an objective assessment that accompanies asthma diagnosis. However, in practice, that's not always the case. And even if there is an objective assessment, sometimes it's not the most appropriate. But there are a range of assessments available that when used appropriately, aren't too bad, but they're not perfect. So you can do things like reversibility challenges, where you simply measure a maximal lung function. So do something like a maximal breath out, and then you give that same individual some salbutamol inhaler, which will hopefully dilate the airway if the individual has asthma, and then you can measure lung function again, and you see sort of an improvement in lung function values. But a lot of the time, especially in athletes, their lung function at rest looks normal, and they won't necessarily respond at rest to a salbutamol inhaler, so you won't see any change. And so there's different types of airway challenges that you can try and do to try and trigger off an asthma response. And the problem with these challenges are that there's two types. There's a direct airway challenge, which directly tries to trigger off a muscle constriction around the airway. Now, this type of challenge, if you're positive to it, it doesn't confirm asthma. But if you're negative to it, it confirms you don't have asthma. Okay? So a positive test doesn't mean you have asthma, it just means you might have asthma. Whereas an indirect airway challenge, where you might try and trigger off an asthma response via maybe exercise or inhalation of dry air, or via inhaling a sort of drug that triggers off and sort of the cascade of asthma inside of the airway. Now, that challenge, if it's positive, it confirms the asthma, but if it's negative, it doesn't rule it out. So there's not the current available assessments aren't perfect. There's not one gold standard test that says yes, positive, definitely asthma, negative, definitely not asthma. And so it's a bit of an art, as I said, in terms of using the test, using the individual's history to try and construct the evidence that's needed to get a secure diagnosis of asthma. And a skilled practitioner can probably make use of these tests well. But a lot of practitioners dealing with individuals, especially when it's mild cases, maybe or aren't experienced or don't have access to all the assessments. That's when things can, a diagnosis can kind of go not as good as we'd hope. And this is kind of the case within elite sport. So this is some of our data that we collected from elite football players. We collected this data just over 10 years ago now. But basically at the time, the regulations were to be able to use asthma inhalers. That the players had to demonstrate they could give us a positive challenge to one of those examples that I showed. And so all of the players that we included in this sample were playing elite level football in the UK. So that's Premier League or Championship or League One. And what we had in this particular study, we had a cohort of 65 players that their initial diagnosis, the reason why they were using asthma inhalers, was because they were reporting symptoms but they've been diagnosed without an objective test. So they've just basically been given the inhaler based on their symptoms and their history of symptoms, rather than any objective proof that they had an asthmatic issue. But when we actually tested them for asthma via the tests I just sort of explained briefly, we found that only half of them could give us a positive test. So we found half the football players that had been given an inhaler without any objective tests, just mainly based on symptoms, were using it, and maybe that diagnosis of asthma wasn't secure. However, as I said before, we've got to take the limitations of the tests that we used in context. So it might have just been the test wasn't sensitive to pick up some of these individuals, but it would stand that actually if these individuals came to us initially, and the objective test didn't demonstrate that there would be any asthma, it would be unlikely that we would recommend that they use an asthma inhaler at that point. So you can see within sport, just by using symptoms alone, it's not recommended at all. And that's some of the work that we do within the clinic at Kent, is to really promote the use of objective assessments and good practice around diagnosis of asthma within the clinic. But obviously you've got half of these players though that they've got breathing problems. The reason why they're using inhalers is they've gone to the doctor and they're complaining that they can't breathe when they're doing high intensity training. So they're complaining that their breathing is impacting their training and their performance. So something's not right, but it might not be that particular issue is related to asthma. So we need to come up with solutions, and this is just to sort of drive that home. We do a lot of support with elite athletes within the clinic, and we supported the British Olympic swimming team over the past 2 Olympic cycles. And some of the stuff that we've picked out from that team kind of just sort of lead into this future innovations, because some of the things we found from them have sort of led on to our next stages of research investigation. So just to reiterate the point around differences in prevalence between sports, when we screen the swimming team and we screen the British boxing team prior to the Rio Olympic Games, you can see the difference in prevalence there. So we had 8% in the British boxers compared to 68% in the swimmers, which is a massive prevalence in the swimmers. But on the flip side, so I said in the previous slide that a lot of athletes get misdiagnosed with asthma. We've also found in the swimmers, we found a lot of athletes who are actually at the elite level, they didn't realize they had asthma. So they were basically slipping through the radar. So using symptoms alone just to detect the individual with asthma maybe isn't appropriate, because a lot of athletes might not report the symptoms or recognize the symptoms. So we start to pick out actually screening large groups of athletes might be important to make sure we get diagnosis accurate. The other thing we also did though, we didn't just look for asthma in the swimmers. We looked a bit more holistically. So we did a kind of a systematic review of their respiratory system. So alongside the asthma test, we did assessments. We either did assessments or we asked questionnaires to look at things like laryngeal closure, nasal disease, recurrent respiratory infections, side effects from inhalers, abnormal breathing sensations. And what we found was every athlete that had an asthmatic issue also had something else going on, another respiratory issue. And we found other respiratory issues in athletes that didn't have asthma. And so this kind of started to ring the bells a little bit, saying, well, actually, it's not just about asthma. You know, asthma is prevalent in elite sport, it's prevalent within swimming, but respiratory issues aren't only caused by asthma, and they're not only solved by dishing out inhalers. So when people are out of breath, walking upstairs or flying up and down the swimming pool, and they've got maybe a diagnosis of asthma, it's not always the case that the asthma is causing the breathlessness. And it's understanding and treating that individual holistically rather than simply looking in that narrow asthma box. And that kind of work led on to a project that I was involved in the background, where my PhD student went on to actually be employed by the English Institute of Sport. And they conducted a study looking at rolling out this sort of systematic assessment of respiratory health within the athletes that are supported by the English Institute of Sport. So these are mainly Olympic sports. And what they did was they rolled out this systematic respiratory health assessment with 122 athletes. So in a similar way to the way we work with the swimmers, they looked for issues like asthma, laryngeal issues, nasal issues, allergies. And what they found was at least one respiratory issue in 80% of the cohort of athletes. So at least 80% of the athletes that went through this systematic respiratory health screening had a respiratory problem, and at least 2 were found in 60% of the athletes. So again, that just highlights the importance of actually managing respiratory issues appropriately in athletes. And nasal issues were the most prevalent. Asthmatic issues, I think 22% of the athletes had an asthmatic issue. But what they also did as well, they looked at kind of the relationship between issues, and what they found was they kind of found clumps, and they found athletes, if they had asthma, were also likely to experience sinus problems and allergy issues. And they also found that individuals with a laryngeal issue were also likely to experience a dysfunctional breathing pattern issue. And so they kind of came up with this sort of heat map, or kind of heat relation map, where the sort of the more orangey it is, the more the issues are related to each other. So there was still some relationship between maybe asthma and a dysfunctional breathing pattern, or sort of asthma and laryngeal obstruction. So they weren't saying that those things couldn't happen with athletes, but it was just more likely that if an athlete had signs of a dysfunctional breathing pattern, that they were also likely to experience a laryngeal issue. And if an athlete had signs of asthma, then they were also likely to experience an allergy or sort of a sinonasal issue. So they started to clump these things together. So just again, just reiterates the fact, looking at the complete airway assessment, rather than sort of putting breathlessness down to either lack of fitness during sport, or putting it down to asthma and solely asthma. And so that kind of leads me on to just talk about another issue. So a lot of these athletes, a lot of the time, it's easy to pick up things. It's easier for medics to pick up things like cardiovascular problems, etc. But there's this big issue around dysfunctional breathing patterns that's starting to crop up more and more in athletes. And we saw a lot of football players experiencing respiratory symptoms, but weren't experiencing asthma. And again, you can see a lot of the athletes in the latest systematic respiratory screening from the English Institute of Sport experiencing symptoms that are more related to dysfunctional breathing patterns. Now, breathing patterns are an interesting topic, and breathing patterns, I think, could be a very good, sort of a global thing to, one, not just help athletes improve their management of any respiratory issue, but they could also be used in a clinical setting or for individuals every day. Because if you think about it, no one ever tells you how to breathe. No one ever teaches you to breathe. You just do. You find a way to do it, because if you don't, you die. So you kind of find a way to breathe. But if you asked sort of your top gurus, what is the perfect way to breathe? There probably isn't, a bit like what is the perfect way to run, for example. There isn't there's a consensus to a point, but there's not anything objective that helps us helps us do that from a pattern point of view. And a lot of the reasons for that are, there's no standardized method. Current methods that you might have seen, so things like using breath by breath technology that maybe you might use to detect cardiopulmonary issues, or do VO2 max tests with, they do measure breathing frequency and tidal volumes, but they don't really tell you much about the way that the breath is generated or the movement of the rib cage. They just give you how often someone is breathing in and out and what the volume is per breath, but they don't tell you how the individual is achieving that. So if you're going to diagnose an athlete with a dysfunctional breathing pattern, you might find that you haven't got there's no objective test there straight away, but also the diagnosis is done by exclusion of other issues and symptoms, sometimes by observing breathing pattern, a little bit similar to the athlete we saw at the start. There aren't any specific questionnaires at the moment, and there's some emerging technology, but this is where I think there's quite a big opportunity to develop some really good technology to support the diagnosis of dysfunctional breathing, but also the management. Because I think that using breathing pattern, actually, we'll show you in a bit, actually might be really valuable just to secure the diagnosis of conditions like asthma or COPD and other issues as well. And so one of our solutions is to use to help characterize breathing pattern, is to use a very sort of technical piece of kit using 3D motion camera technology, and similar technology to the way they sort of make avatars in films and things. But I said at the top here, it's an expensive solution because it requires expensive motion capture system. It requires these markers. It requires experienced technicians to run it and interpret the data. So even though we can get a lot of information out of this analysis, it's not readily available. It's not like you can just walk into your local GP and they can run this analysis for you. So it's not readily available, but we're using it to help us understand breathing pattern. And so the way this sort of system works, you can see this participant here has got a lot of markers, reflective markers on their chest and on their back. And what that does is it allows us to create a 3D model of the torso, so we can get sort of abdomen, lower rib cage and upper rib cage. And so we can then now quantify the movements of the rib cage, the abdomen, and the back, and we can look at the coordination of the movements. We can split it up into looking at left and right, or just simply looking at maybe the top row of markers versus the bottom row with the rib cage markers. Also, we can do lots and lots of different analysis with it. But one of the things we're trying to do is simplify it a little bit and just look at rib cage movement, which is on this on the vertical axis, and versus abdomen movement. And what we started to see is in what we're kind of deeming a healthy breathing pattern. So this is someone that's not complaining of respiratory symptoms during exercise, and they haven't got respiratory disease. What we see in sort of these healthy breathers is that when they take a breath in, so this is when the figure's going left to right on the graph. As they breathe in, you can see that the abdomen moves, but the rib cage moves at the same time. So we get this nice 45-degree angle of the sort of breath in. So the abdomen and rib cage move together on the way in, and then they move together on the way out. And just nice and smoothly goes in and out. And we see that pattern at rest. We see it during exercise, and we see it during recovery from exercise. So that's a nice pattern to work from, and that's helping us understand breathing patterns. So what we've done is we've got various individuals to go through some assessments in the lab, where we've got individuals that haven't got a breathing issue, we've got individuals with asthma, and we've got individuals without asthma, but who have a question mark dysfunctional breathing pattern issue. And so we got them to basically cycle at various intensities. You can see this individual doing it. You can see the lots of markers on. You see the cameras, and you can see the model being captured in the background there.
Good. Keep pushing it.
Okay. And what that does is it allows us to create these models, and you can see this in real time now. So we look at the top right hand figure here. That's the abdomen versus the rib cage movement going in and out. And this is an individual at rest. You can see that nice 45-degree angle. We flip onto somebody who again hasn't got a breathing problem, but this is during exercise. The actual figure itself is wobbling because they're cycling. But when we take out the noise of the movement and we actually look at the breathing pattern, you can see again, nice 45-degree angle to it, nice synchrony between the abdomen and the rib cage. And then we look at the same an issue, someone who had a healthy breathing in recovery, similar picture. So when we look at someone who's got an asthmatic issue, when we actually look at their breathing pattern at rest, when their asthma isn't obstructed, you can see again, same thing. They get this nice smooth movement. So an asthmatic breathing pattern, when they're not obstructed, they're not experiencing asthma, looks healthy, looks fine, which you should do. But when we actually trigger off an asthma response, this is the breathing pattern we see. So you can see the change in the breathing pattern with an individual experiencing an asthma response. And what we see is that the abdomen, you see this change in the breathing pattern. So the abdomen is moving first, and then the rib cage moves on the breath in, and then the rib cage moves, and then the abdomen moves on the breath out. And then we give the individual an inhaler to reverse the obstruction they've got in their airway, and their breathing pattern starts to return to a healthy breathing pattern. So again, you can see how you can use breathing pattern, one, to maybe support a diagnosis of asthma, but also you could use breathing pattern to monitor recovery after an exacerbation, or maybe even as an early warning sign for somebody to start taking, maybe start using their inhalers, or to maybe use their emergency inhaler as a pre-warning to maybe an exacerbation coming on. So there's potential there for a variety of different things. And this is someone with a dysfunctional breathing pattern. So this is an individual where they haven't got an asthmatic issue, but they've got basically reporting difficulty in breathing in during high intensity exercise. And that difficulty in breathing in is because they're not moving their rib cage effectively. So the coordination of their rib cage movement isn't particularly good. So just let it go again. Okay, so you can see if it's going to play through. I'll click on to the next one. So this is during exercise. You can see that their abdomen's moving, then their rib cage is moving, and then their abdomen moves, and the rib cage moves on the way out. And so what you get is this sort of true asynchrony in their breath. So you almost create this sort of a circle rather than a nice 45-degree angle that's nice and tight. And in recovery, we see the same thing, that dysfunctional breathing pattern stays the same. Now, with dysfunctional breathers, once we've actually identified them, there's not a drug that you can give them to improve that. That is purely down to improving their movement mechanics. It's down to a sort of respiratory therapy, respiratory physio, to work with the individual to improve their breathing pattern, and their symptoms will improve. I'll show you an example of that in a touch. So you can see there the stark difference in the breathing patterns between conditions in individuals. So breathing pattern might not just be a way of detecting something like a dysfunctional breathing pattern. It might also be a way of actually managing and supporting the diagnosis of conditions like asthma, which might sort of solve that problem I sort of mentioned at the start there about the issue around misdiagnosis of asthma and the cost to the healthcare services. But even when we look, and you can see this is just a demonstrated dysfunctional breathing isn't just one type. So this is kind of 3 examples of 3 different types of dysfunctional breathing. So you can see that the one on the left-hand side here, when they breathe in, it's kind of abdomen, rib cage on the way in, but when they breathe out, it's all kind of synced up together. And it's only their breath in which is kind of out of sync. Then you've got the individual in the middle here who is really rib cage movement first. So this individual is probably more of a sort of shoulder lift initially with their breath, and then they try and move their abdomen towards the end of the breath, and then they breathe out. The abdomen moves first, and then the rib cage comes down. And so again, that sort of demonstrates a different type of dysfunctional breathing. And a third way is the abdomen moves, and then the rib cage moves, and then the rib cage moves, then the abdomen moves. So there's different forms of dysfunctional breathing that we can detect from these systems, but you can see they're all away from this nice smooth 45-degree angle. So we can use the breathing pattern diagnosis or this system to detect the breathing pattern and then educate the individual about what we want them to do to improve their breathing pattern. And when we do that, and the way we might educate them is by using a variety of different techniques. There's sort of respiratory physio that might focus on breathing technique and posture. We can then build in things like respiratory muscle training to support that. So there's a variety of different techniques we can do, but when we do that, it can be quite effective. So again, I'll just go back to this athlete. And this athlete, we actually ended up diagnosing with a dysfunctional breathing pattern in the end. So I'll just remind you of her breathing pattern to start with.
Brilliant. You stand up for me. You stand up. Just
so with her,
stand still and look
you'll see her stomach and chest aren't moving together. You can hear that wheeze, that laryngeal issue.
Keep looking straight ahead.
And you see her shoulders just disappearing straight up. And then we basically educated her. We told her what was causing that. We put her through she did really well with the breathing exercises. And then this is 2 months later, the same individual.
Can you just stand up for us? Just look dead straight forward. You just pull your shirt tight if you can, so I can see it. That's it.
You can see better coordination between the stomach and abdomen. There's no wheezing going on.
Good work.
Much better control, much better posture. She's now getting more appropriate movement in her lower rib cage, moving sideways as well as upwards and forwards. And you can just see her breathing pattern is better and she's recovering better. And she's also not complaining that her breathing is limiting her performance when she's running. So that consideration of actually what it might not be asthma that's causing the problem, it might be something else, might be a dysfunctional breathing pattern, is crucial to actually managing individuals' respiratory problems. So just a couple of slides just to finish up. So what does the future look like? So that's kind of where we're at now. But what do we need? I think we need a better understanding of how breathing patterns can be used to diagnose and manage respiratory conditions. So it's obviously going to be key for dysfunctional breathing patterns, but I think there's also a role for it in managing other respiratory issues. We need to improve accessibility to the technology that allows for measurement of breathing pattern. So we want technology that's accessible by practitioners in a clinical setting, maybe even some technology that allows you to measure your breathing pattern in a similar way to what I've just demonstrated there in a home or a field-based setting. So that maybe you can measure your breathing pattern and upload into a system, and your asthma nurse or someone can check your breathing pattern at distance. We need to, there's benefits to potentially to incorporating breathing pattern assessment into breathing pattern training programs. So when individuals are sent to respiratory physios, to incorporate actually objective assessments of breathing pattern, but also we can look to include it in real-time feedback. So individuals might be able to watch their breathing pattern and look how they're performing and change accordingly and see the benefits of it. And also we need to improve public understanding of breathing pattern. For example, I think a lot of individuals opt out of doing exercise at quite an early age, because when they try and exercise hard, maybe their breathing pattern isn't allowing them to exercise, so they feel short and tight of breath. They don't enjoy doing exercise, so they choose not to do it. And I think a lot of those early decisions are partly in part due to kind of breathing patterns. So early education of why an individual might be breathless and how to manage that and how to improve your breathing pattern might actually have quite a big impact in terms of the physical activity numbers that the population as a whole get up to. How are we going to do that? Potential technology. Well, there are already some technologies out there, but they're not in terms of the ones that are accessible. They don't give you the type of information that we can currently get from OEP, and also if they do, they're very noisy, so they only allow you to get some of the information, but only maybe at rest or sitting down. But what we want to do is try and create technology that allows an individual to maybe us to monitor their breathing pattern in a sort of a natural environment for them. So that could mean some of the ideas we've had. It could involve generating using video camera technology in a phone to maybe sort of just coach an app to track movement and track markers in the chest. It could involve wearing things like wearable sensors or wearable microchips that pick up movements of various parts of the bodies. It could involve wearing some sort of straps around the system, or it could involve embedding those straps within some sort of wearable tech as well. And all of these ideas are being explored at the moment. We're doing some of it within Kent, and others doing some of it around the world. And that, I think that technology is moving on, but that's what I'd love to see us in sort of 10, 20, 30 years time with a system that is relatively non-invasive, but gives us quite a detailed outlook into these respiratory markers that we can currently get via the fancy motion capture system, but making it more accessible. And if we can do that, then I think breathing pattern actually has quite a big role to understand the health and to actually enhance performance, not just of elite athletes, but just actually allow everyone to enjoy physical activity without feeling that they're out of breath.